This was probably one of the most important straits in the country. It's been a gathering place for probably a half a dozen centuries. It was a major launching point for westward expansion. It was a corridor for commerce and the growth of our country. First came the indigenous to trade, to pass through, and to gather. And then a major trading post in the upper Great Lakes. In 1812, it was the location of a battle for control of those upper Great Lakes. It was the law and order of the area, and it was probably a major reason for the existence of the city of Chicago.
And today it sees over 1 million visitors from all over the world.
Let's explore the history of these straits, the kind that doesn't make it into the tourist brochures, and from a perspective that most people don't get to see. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
From the Mackinac Straits, the channel is Restless Viking. Let's go on an adventure. So the Anishinaabe used to fish this area, and they would gather here and trade here for centuries. The first documented European was Etienne Brulé, who came through the Straits, and he noted this rock over here. It was about 9 feet tall, and it was a way to navigate from this point to know that you're entering the Straits, because there was no big landmarks here except for this big rock. And it really was quite a land feature. That's McGulpin Rock. You can still visit it today. It's kind of immovable. It's quite a few tons. We're shooting from the hip, but I think it was like 30 tons. 54 tons of rock! And they also gauged the water level of the lake from that rock. So our story starts here. So Etienne Brulé, he kind of comes up through the Straits after the indigenous people. And then Father Marquette comes through, a Jesuit missionary, and in 1671 he establishes a mission. Then the French, of course, were trading furs back then. In 1683, they established a fort. I think it was Fort Brulé. Then they abandoned the fort. They sent the garrison down to Fort Detroit. And then by 1713, the French decided that they needed to reestablish a post up here in the Straits of Mackinac. So in 1713, they sent a contingent of troops up here to build Fort Michilimackinac. Then in 1761, the British defeated the French in the French and Indian War, and the British got the fort. You can see today that the British flag is flying. Now the French had a tradition of giving some nice gifts to the natives in the area each year, but the British, they weren't so generous, and that kind of caused a little tension. And on June 2nd of 1763, Pontiac's rebellion was going on throughout the Great Lakes. So the Ojibwa established a game that was the precursor to lacrosse called, I think, Begadawi. And of course the British, they're like, nah, quite interesting, the games that these natives play.
So the British let their guard down. As the story goes, the natives hit the ball into the fort to gain access.
Well, after they got in, they controlled the fort for about a year, I guess. The agreement was they'll get nicer gifts than they got before, so the British got control of the fort back. So the British decided that the fort was not very defensible being on the mainland, so they searched around for an island. So in 1781, across the Straits to that big island, the British said, yes, let's build our fort there. Quite, yes.
Yes.
So when the British decided to move Fort Michilimackinac, they moved it here to Mackinac Island in Fort Mackinac. And it's got an interesting history. It's a colonial era fort, and it had some battles in 1812, and there's actually 2 forts on Mackinac Island. There's Fort Mackinac, and then on a high spot behind it is Fort Holmes, where the British during the War of 1812 brought some cannons to that high spot, fired upon Fort Mackinac, and knowing that they didn't have any way to defend against it, the Americans said, all right, it's yours. Then they captured a lot of ships here too. By flying the false colors in the fort, a ship would arrive and they would say, your ship belongs to us, including the ship that I sail on, the Friends Goodwill. That was one that was captured here. During the Civil War, they held a few prisoners at Fort Mackinac. They've had a Christmas mutiny at Fort Mackinac. It became our state's first state park, and I believe it became the nation's second national park. And then when all the important nation building was done in the Mackinac Straits, the railroads came. And when the railroads came, this place became a tourist mecca, with Mackinac Island today receiving over 1 million visitors a year. And that number continues to grow as cruise ships enter the Great Lakes. And you can see a couple launches over there with some of their excursion launches. Looks like they got some dock space here now, and even cruise ships come to Mackinac Island. And then way over there is the Grand Hotel. And the Grand Hotel was built by railroad interests to encourage passengers to go north to Mackinac so they could get the revenue and fare, and then they could rent the hotel to their guests and make a little extra money doing that. So the Straits today is a tourist destination full of history. Then there's Round Island. It's across from Mackinac Island, and besides some lighthouse keepers, it's been uninhabited pretty much for a couple centuries, it's believed. Round Island didn't have a lot of importance in the Straits, except that's where apparently cholera victims, when ships would come in, they'd have to bury their victims. They weren't allowed into port unless they buried their victims somewhere else, and it was on Round Island. This lighthouse was almost lost in the 70s when the high waters got up and tore away half of the corner on the other side of the lighthouse. And just off land, there's these mysterious concrete things with steel around it. It says mooring danger, and it says Moing Dolphins. And these dolphins were built during the Cold War. Kincheloe Air Force Base was located 33 miles inland, and they had B-52s and fighter jets, and they needed to get a high volume of jet fuel. So the tankers would come in to these Moing Dolphins. You can see the pipeline. They offloaded the jet fuel, then went to storage tanks on the shore. And then from the storage tanks, it would be pumped 33 miles to Kincheloe Air Force Base to refuel the jet fighters and the B-52s. And today, they're a cormorant and a seagull Airbnb. Maybe it's a hip camp. Remnants of the Cold War history of the Mackinac Straits area. Just a few days after Pearl Harbor, the icebreaker Mackinac was commissioned, which at the time became the most powerful ship on the Great Lakes, and it was able to break a lot of ice. It's been retired now. It's a ship's museum in Mackinac City. And it was a project that was completed by Rosie the Riveters. Rosie's the Riveter? Rosie the Riveter?
So the Toledo Shipping Company earned the contract to build the Mackinac, but because of all the delays, they had to pay fines, and they actually went bankrupt. And then another shipping company took over the build. So
if you're in Mackinac sucking on an ice cream cone, wondering what you should do next, I think that'd be a pretty interesting tour. So then another artifact right next to the Coast Guard icebreaker is a railroad apron where rail cars used to be loaded on, usually the Chief Wawatam. And this is the apron where the railroad cars would come on to the ship. Still in existence. The Wawawantum had quite a long history. I think it was from the teens, in the 19-teens, until the 70s, before it was decommissioned and became a barge, so to speak, and then eventually scrapped. The Chief Wawawantum used to haul rail cars from here to St. Ignace and back. And it also provided troops for the strike, the miners' strike that happened in Keweenaw. It brought the troops up to the UP, and it also hauled cars across the Straits before the Mackinac Bridge was made. And then over here on this dock, which is a barge in front of a dock, is where the state car ferries extended the highways from the Lower Peninsula up to the Upper Peninsula before the Mackinac Bridge existed. The state of Michigan started offering ferry service from the Lower Peninsula to the Upper Peninsula back, I believe, in 1923. And they started by buying an old boat for $10,000 that used to, a river boat from the Detroit River. They put $9,000 into it. And then they came up here and they started hauling cars, about 20 at a time. And in the first year, the little Ariel, the name of the boat, actually hauled over 10,000 vehicles, 20 at a time. Eventually, the state of Michigan bought a dock in St. Ignace, and then they bought a dock here. And the dock still exists. This is the old dock where you used to load your cars on until about 1957. They had quite a fleet. From that first year, where they did over 10,000 vehicles, the second year they did 38,000 vehicles because they added 2 ships, I guess, that could do about 40 cars each. This here is a car elevator. To get to the upper decks of those older boats, the cars would pull in from the other side, then they would be raised up, and then they would come out here onto the upper decks of the other boats. And it still exists today. And the state of Michigan continued to add and upgrade their fleet until eventually, by the 1950s, they could haul 500 cars at a time. Their fleet had a capacity of 500 cars. And then in 1956, they hauled 900,000 cars from the Upper Peninsula to the lower, and from the lower to the Upper Peninsula. Then in 1957, in the first 10 months of 1957, they beat that 900,000 car record until November 1st of 1957, when the Mackinac Bridge was completed. There was no need for the ferries after that. The largest ferry that was ever produced was the queen of the fleet, the Vacation Land. And the Vacation Land, after it was done here in the 50s, it went out to Quebec to haul cars across the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then eventually it ended up out in Vancouver, where it was hauling cars for quite some time, throughout the 60s, I believe, and into the 70s. And then it was going to be used as a support vessel for the North Slope of Alaska because the oil embargo, but the oil embargo ended and they didn't need it anymore. So it was eventually sold for scrap, and it was going to be towed, and it was towed out the Columbia River, made it about 100 miles from the Columbia River under tow, and it sank in 12,000 feet of water. And today, what is really interesting is that the car elevator and the docks, for the most part, are here. But it looks like they're doing some kind of work here. Maybe this is just where they keep state barges, but if anybody knows what the future of the state ferry docks are, please let us know. Behind us is an observation dock, or an observation pier, that you can come out onto, and you can see the remnants of the state ferry docks. So the Mackinac Bridge was eventually being considered throughout the 50s, and one of the proposals for the Mackinac Bridge was actually about 36 miles, I think, which would have started way down there by Sheboygan and went out there to Boblo Island by using causeways and small bridges. And then it would go from Boblo Island over to Round Island, and then a bridge over to Mackinac Island where it would turn, and then it would head across the strait on a bridge from Mackinac Island over to St. Ignace. It was decided that that was quite an undertaking, so instead they built the 5-mile span of the Mackinac Bridge.
Before the Mackinac Bridge was built, people would take an hour ferry ride across these straits. Bridge construction started on May 7th, 1954, and it took them 3 years. It finally opened on November 1st, 1957.
So yeah, that was a test for popping. As the waves reflect off and come back, they create clapotuses, which are kind of rough seas. Trying to talk is with the boats going like this. Good job, Poppins.
It's always an adventure with Chuck, that's for sure. This bridge spans 5 miles and has 42,000 miles of cable. Sadly, 5 workers perished while building this bridge. Oh, I got so wet. Sadly, 2 cars went over the side of the bridge. So this bridge has been hit 3 times by ships. Twice at the Northern Pier in 1968 and in 2021. And the 3rd hit was a crane on the top of a barge. They didn't even know that it had hit the bridge. Whoa! Until they discovered the damage on the crane. So they came back and inspected the bridge and there was no structural damage. That happened in 2023.
I do think the Mackinac Bridge is the third largest bridge in the United States, and it's just an icon across. It's the only way you can get from the lower peninsula to the upper peninsula that doesn't involve a boat or going through another state.
Well, Chuck, we are beating the traffic.
We are.
Check this out. It's a weekend in July and the traffic is backed up on the bridge. The only way to get into the UP.
And way up there is the toll booth that everyone's trying to get through. This was an important highway of commerce because to go overland from, let's say, New York to Mackinac would have taken a couple months, but by sea, 4 or 5 days. So this was very important in the building and the expansion of our country. So that's a tiny fraction of the history of the Straits of Mackinac. We hope you enjoyed this off the hip, didn't research it, and probably I'm gonna get some comments. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
The channel's Restless Viking. Thanks for exploring with us.